So now we come to the paragraphs which I consider the most important paragraphs in Answer to Job. It was in reading these 4 paragraphs that I finally had an epiphany that put religion into context for me. I'm reading from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, paragraph 751. One would be very ill-advised to identify me with such a childish standpoint. However, I have been asked so often whether I believe in the existence of God or not that I am somewhat concerned lest I be taken for an adherent of psychologism far more commonly than I suspect. What most people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. They believe only in physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. That is no less absurd than the assumption that a non-real psyche is responsible for it. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically but not physically. Equally, these people have still not got it into their heads that the psychology of religion falls into 2 categories, which must be sharply distinguished from one another. Firstly, the psychology of the religious person, and secondly, the psychology of religion proper, i.e., of religious contents. Paragraph 752. It is chiefly my experiences in the latter field which have given me the courage to enter into the discussion of the religious question, and especially into the pros and cons of the dogma of the Assumption, which, by the way, I consider to be the most important religious event since the Reformation. It is a petra scandali for the unpsychological mind. How can such an unfounded assertion as the bodily reception of the Virgin into heaven be put forward as worthy of belief? But the method which the Pope uses in order to demonstrate the truth of the dogma makes sense to the psychological mind, because it bases itself firstly on the necessary prefigurations, and secondly on a tradition of religious assertions reaching back for more than 2,000 years. Clearly, the material evidence for the existence of this psychic phenomenon is more than sufficient. It does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the physis. What outrages the Protestant standpoint in particular is the boundless approximation of the diapora to the Godhead, and, in consequence, the endangered supremacy of Christ, from which Protestantism will not budge. In sticking to this point, it has obviously failed to consider that its hymnology is full of references to the Heavenly Bridegroom, who is now suddenly supposed not to have a bride with equal rights. Or has perchance the bridegroom, in true psychologistic manner, been understood as a mere metaphor? Paragraph 753. The logical consistency of the Papal Declaration cannot be surpassed, and it leaves Protestantism with the odium of being nothing but a man's religion, which allows no metaphysical representation of woman. In this respect, it is similar to Mithraicism, and Mithraicism found this prejudice very much to its detriment. Protestantism has obviously not given sufficient attention to the signs of the times, which point to the equality of women. But this equality requires to be anchored metaphysically in the figure of a divine woman, the bride of Christ. Just as the person of Christ cannot be replaced by an organization, so the bride cannot be replaced by the church. The feminine, like the masculine, demands an equally personal representation. Paragraph 754. The dogmatizing of the Assumption does not, however, according to the dogmatic view, mean that Mary has attained the status of a goddess, although as mistress of heaven, as opposed to the prince of the sublunary aerial realm, Satan, and mediatrix, she is functionally on a par with Christ, the King and Mediator. At any rate, her position satisfies the need of the archetype. The new dogma expresses a renewed hope for the fulfillment of that yearning for peace which stirs deep down in the soul, and for a resolution of the threatening tension between the opposites. Everyone shares this tension, and everyone experiences it in his individual form of unrest. The more so, the less he sees any possibility of getting rid of it by rational means. It is no wonder, therefore, that the hope, indeed the expectation of divine intervention, arises in the collective unconscious and at the same time in the masses. The Papal Declaration has given comforting expression to this yearning. How could Protestantism so completely miss the point? This lack of understanding can only be explained by the fact that the dogmatic symbols and hermeneutic allegories have lost their meaning for Protestant rationalism. This is also true in some measure of the opposition to the new dogma within the Catholic Church itself, or rather to the dogmatization of the old doctrine. Naturally, a certain degree of rationalism is better suited to Protestantism than it is to the Catholic outlook. The latter gives the archetypal symbolism the necessary freedom and space in which to develop over the centuries, while at the same time insisting on their original form, unperturbed by intellectual difficulties and the objections of rationalists. In this way, the Catholic Church demonstrates her maternal character, because she allows the tree growing out of her matrix to develop according to its own laws. Protestantism, in contrast, is committed to the paternal spirit. Not only did it develop at the outset from an encounter with the worldly spirit of the times, but it continues this dialectic with the spiritual currents of every age. For the pneuma, in keeping with its original and wild nature, is flexible, even in living motion, comparable now to water, now to fire. It can desert its original haunts, can even go astray and get lost if it succumbs too much to the spirit of the age. In order to fulfill its task, the Protestant spirit must be full of unrest and occasionally troublesome. It must even be revolutionary, so as to make sure that tradition has an influence on the change of contemporary values. The shocks it sustains during this encounter modify at the same time enliven the tradition, which in its slow progress through the centuries would, without these disturbances, finally arrive at complete petrifaction and thus lose its effect. By merely criticizing and opposing certain developments within the Catholic Church, Protestantism would gain only a miserable bit of vitality, unless, mindful of the fact that Christianity consists of two separate camps, or rather, it is a disunited brother-sister pair. It remembers that besides defending its own existence, it must acknowledge Catholicism's right to exist, too. A brother who, for theological reasons, wanted to cut the thread of his elder sister's life would rightly be called inhuman, to say nothing of Christian charity. And the converse is also true. Nothing is achieved by merely negative criticism. It is justified only to the degree that it is creative. Therefore, it would seem profitable to me if, for example, Protestantism admitted that it is shocked by the new dogma, not only because it throws a distressing light on the gulf between brother and sister, but because, for fundamental reasons, a situation has developed within Christianity which removes it further than ever from the sphere of worldly understanding. Protestantism knows, or could know, how much it owes its very existence to the Catholic Church. How much or how little does the Protestant still possess if he can no longer criticize or protest? In view of the intellectual scandalon, which the new dogma represents, he should remind himself of his Christian responsibility. Am I my brother's, or in this case my sister's, keeper? And examine in all seriousness the reasons, explicit or otherwise, that decided the declaration of the new dogma. In so doing, he should guard against casting cheap aspersions, and would do well to assume that there is more in it than papal arbitrariness. It would be desirable for the Protestant to understand that the new dogma has placed upon him a new responsibility toward the worldly spirit of the age, for he cannot simply deny his problematic sister before the eyes of the world. He must, even if he finds her antipathetic, be fair to her if he does not want to lose his self-respect. For instance, this is a favorable opportunity for him to ask himself, for a change, what is the meaning not only of the new dogma, but of all more or less dogmatic assertions over and above their literal concretism. Considering the arbitrary and protean state of his own dogmas and the precarious, schism-ridden condition of his church, he cannot afford to remain rigid and impervious to the spirit of the age. And since, in accordance with his obligations to the Zeitgeist, he is more concerned to come to terms with the world and its ideas than with God, it would seem clearly indicated that, on the occasion of the entry of the Mother of God into the heavenly bridal chamber, he should bend to the great task of reinterpreting all the Christian traditions. If it is a question of truths which are anchored deep in the soul, and no one with the slightest insight can doubt this fact, then the solution of this task must be possible. For this we need the freedom of the Spirit, which, as we know, is assured only in Protestantism. The dogma of the Assumption is a slap in the face for the historical and rationalistic view of the world, and would remain so for all time if one were to insist obstinately on the arguments of reason and history. This is a case, if ever there was one, where psychological understanding is needed, because the mythologism coming to light is so obvious that we must be deliberately blinding ourselves if we cannot see its symbolic nature and interpret it in symbolic terms.